Welcome back. So I wanted to go into some more complex things that you can do with methods. So for example, we can have one method call another method inside of it. So let's say, let's delete all this, and we're going to have two methods, public static void method 1, and we're going to have public static void method 2. Okay. So both of these have no parameters or no arguments, whatever you want to call it, and they both have a void return type. So we're not really passing along any information, but we can easily change that if we want to. So if we say sysout method 1 was called, and in method 2, if we say sysout method 2 was called. So if we say method 1 on that, then we should get the message method 1 was called, which is true. If we replace that 1 with a 2, hit run, method 2 was called. Okay, great. So what if we said inside method 1, what if we put a call to method 2? Like that, right at the end. And then if we ran method 1, what happens? Okay, so both methods were called. So we go to method 1, we run that line, then we make a call to method 2. So method 2 gets called, so this line runs, and then when this finishes, it goes back to this call. Then this method finishes and goes back to this call. So that means we could do two method 2 calls. Let's put one before and one after, like that. So now before we print out that method 1 was called, we're going to call method 2. Sure enough, it prints out that method 2 was called first, even though we called method 1 first. But that's just a matter of when we're actually displaying the message that it was called, because of course method 1 was called first. So we called method 1, but before it prints out the message, it calls method 2, so method 2 prints out its message, and then method 1 can finally print out its message, and then it calls method 2 a second time, and that message gets printed out again. So here we have an instance of methods calling other methods. And this is also something that a lot of functional languages will do. Okay. What if we have some information that we want to pass into a method, but we don't know exactly what information that will be? So, for example, if we want to call method 1, but method 1 takes an int a, something like that. And then method 2, we'll say it takes an int a as well. Now it's important to realize that this int a and this int a are completely different. So to demonstrate that, we're going to call method 1 and we're going to pass in a number 3. And we're going to call method 2 and pass in the number 5. So if we sys out a for both of these methods, we should get 3 and 5. And sure enough, we do. So when you're naming a variable inside of a method, the name itself is sort of arbitrary. It's just a placeholder name because we need to take the information that we're storing right here, because we're just passing in the number 3. It doesn't actually have a variable name attached to it. We just want to pass that number in, and that means we need somewhere to store it. So we're going to store it in a variable that we create, just call it a. So that also means if we have a variable called a out here, int a equals 4. So now there's actually 3 different a variables. There's this a, and then there's an a here, and an a here. So if we sys out a, then will we get 3, 4, or 5? Well, we still get 3 and 5, because this 4 variable, this a up here, is completely separate from these 2 down here. And that goes into something called scoping, which I will be talking about in a future video, because that is a very huge aspect of programming that a lot of people struggle with. Okay. So we can use this to send information in between methods. So for example, if we just call method 1 and pass in the number 3, or actually, let's do this. Let's call method 2, but we're going to pass in method 1. Now this may seem odd at first, but let's see what happens. So right now, method 2 is giving us an error because it doesn't take, or it needs an int, but method 1 doesn't return anything. So let's walk through slowly what I just said. So if we cut this part out, just for now, we have method 2. And right now, method 2 is yelling at us because it needs an int variable, such as the number 6. Right, now it's happy. When we pass in method 3, or method 1, but with the 3 in the arguments, method 1 has a void return type. So that means it does not return any data. So this line right here is actually basically just blank. It's like saying that. So that's why it's yelling at us. And if we read the error message, the method 2 int and the type blah 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 is not applicable for the argument void. So again, void, that's this. It means it doesn't return anything. So we can't use it like a number. We can't say int a equals void. It doesn't work. So instead we're going to change this to an int. We're going to change both of these to an int, as a matter of fact. And that means we need to specify a return. So what are we going to return? Well, for method 1, let's return a times 2, just for fun. And for method 2, let's return a plus 4. Okay. So now before we run this, let's walk through what should happen. So we're going to call method 2. All right, so we go down to method 2. Method 2 requires an int in order to run. Okay, so let's see what int we passed in. So we passed in method 1 with 3 in the parentheses. Okay, so we're making a call to method 1. So let's go to there and see what we need. So we need an int. Okay, we know that's 3. So a equals 3. And we're going to return 3 times 2. So that's 6. So because we're returning it, this goes back to the method call. So this entire method call like that, method 1, that gets replaced with the number 6. So essentially we're just saying method 2 and passing in the number 6. 6 plus 4 is 10. So do we get 10? We forgot to print it out. So, of course, it's not going to show anything until we say sysout. And then we can just put this entire thing inside the parentheses. Now let's run it. Hey, there's 10. So it worked exactly how we predicted it would. So that's how we can pass methods, the results of methods as arguments for other methods. So result meaning that's what gets returned, and argument being this is what we're passing in, or we're putting inside the parentheses of a method. So we have method 2, and then we have the parentheses. So whatever we put inside these parentheses, that's our argument. And so the argument of method 1 would be 3. All right, now let's talk a little bit more about void return types. So I mentioned that we don't need to say return in a void return type method, but that doesn't mean we can't say return. So if we go back to one method, if we say public static void, we're going to call it test, and let's say we print out A. So if we call this, it should work out fine. So test 10 should print out the number 10. Okay, there we go. So we don't need to say return. It works perfectly fine the way it is. But we can still put a return at the end. And this time we don't have to put anything after it. We can just say return. Because if we did put something after it, it would yell at you. Because it's a void return type. So we're not actually sending any data. We're just saying the method is done. We are returning to where the call was made. So if I said return 4, it doesn't like that because it's a void return type. We can't return data on a void return type. So if we put that back to normal, now it still runs smoothly. We run it again. We still get 10. Everything's fine. Everything's hunky-dory. But we can still use this as what's known as a control statement. And I think we've talked about this before with loops. So a control statement is just something that affects the flow of your code, or it controls the flow of how your program runs. So the same way we did before with the if-else statement, we can say if A is equal to 10, then we're going to say this is a special occasion. Something like that. And then we can say return. And now, if we run it, instead of printing out 10, like it should have done here, instead it prints out the message, this is a special occasion, and then it returns. So this means drop everything, go back to where you were called. So it drops everything, goes back up here, and these two lines down here never happened. So again, we don't need to say return here. And it still works just fine. So you could almost think of this as a makeshift else. So, for example, if we remove return, if we comment that line out and we run it, it says this is a special occasion, and it also prints the number 10. Because we never told it to go back. We just said, if A is 10, print this message. When you're done, print that message too. If we put an else here, and then we run it, now it only prints the first message again. Because it says, this is a special occasion because A is equal to 10. And because A is equal to 10, that means we're not going to run this line. And then, so we skip over it, and we get to this bracket, which corresponds to here. So we're done with this method, and we go back here. So this line never gets run. But again, we already showed we can do that without using an else, if we just have this return statement right here. That essentially works the same way. So you can use that to your advantage if you have, an if statement and you know that you're going to be done. Once you run that code inside of that if statement, you could just put a return. You don't have to say, well, now I need an else because I only want this to run if this condition's false, if A is not equal to 10. I mean, yes, that'll work, but it's still, it's redundant. You don't have to say that. You don't need the else. It runs the exact same way. If we take the else out, it's still going to run the exact same thing because we already know if we reached this point right here, that means that means this condition was not satisfied, because if this condition was satisfied, it would have returned by now. But it didn't, so we're able to run this without any problems. And that's another way that you can sort of use returns to your advantage. Well, I think that's going to be it for this video. If I do think of more stuff pertaining to methods, I will for sure make another video on that, but I'm assuming that most of the new info is going to be pertaining to related to classes. So once we get into objects and classes, which will be a huge topic, mainly for Java, which is an object-oriented language, then there will be a lot more things to talk about. We could talk about overloading, overriding, the dot operator, all that sort of fun stuff. So be looking for that in the future, and I will see you then.